Welcome to your favorite time of the week, or certainly our favorite time of the week, podcasting for business. This is episode 4. Ron's episode 4?
Holy shit! Like that happened pretty quick. It seems like doing these two times a week is more fun than we thought it was.
Absolutely. We've also got a special guest joining us right now, a very good friend of ours, Mick Hawes, who of course is the founder of Builders Business Blackbelt. He's also joining us from international waters on a boat. How is it being away from terra firma, Mick?
A bit wobbly, bit side to side. You know how it is.
Good to have you, Mick.
Mick's an absolute wealth of knowledge in terms of business and so many other things, podcasting as well. So we're super excited to have him here today. If this is your first time joining us, we're going to go through what's making news in the podcast and business world. We're going to go into today's tactic, which is the 3 elements of a good sounding podcast. We're going to dive a bit into Mick's background and what has helped him achieve the success that he has had, and also what are the things that he's working on with his clients and what's working well with them. And then we're going to share the big mistake for today that business owners make with their podcast, and that is forgetting to include and engage your audience in your podcast content. So we're going to take a deep dive into that mistake and give you some strategies to be able to implement some good things for that in your podcast and your business. Rons, to kick things off, what are you seeing that's making news?
What is making news? Sorry, I was looking at the text, so I was a bit sidetracked. And there's a bit of delay. What's making news? So I was quite interested in the news that kind of like what platforms are actually being used in the different countries around the planet, and that was super interesting for me. As in, like, there's research and studies done on what kind of platforms do listeners mainly use in the UK, in the US, in Germany, and in Australia. And I'm keen to get your thoughts. Like, James, what do you think? Like, in the UK, which is like the top platform, what do you reckon?
I've always, as you know, for anyone who's a loyal listener of this show, loyal viewer, Spotify. I feel like Spotify should have a pretty strong presence in the UK, but
Okay, so UK, US, Germany, Australia. Do you reckon that changes anywhere? Mick, I'm keen to hear what do you think. What do you think is the most used platform in these 4 countries? If you maybe you kind of don't have a preference about the country, but maybe you would want to pick the most used platform in these areas.
I'm going to go with Zoom for a tech platform, particularly since COVID came in. I mean, nobody had heard of it before.
Yeah, not
COVID, but then
not a tech platform really, but this is where people listen to podcasts. So, what platforms do they listen?
Oh, I see.
To podcasts on.
Yeah, I'd go with the Spotify.
Yeah,
for sure.
All right, team. Yeah. You guys are in for a treat because research has been done, and actually the data has been collected in 2021, and it was an online questionnaire, and the whole study has been compiled by Pod News. So shout out to James Cridlin and Pod News. But what platforms do you use to listen to podcasts? In the UK, it's BBC Sounds, which is quite interesting. In the US, It's YouTube Podcasts, and Spotify is 3rd on the list. In Germany, yes, it's Spotify by quite a bit. And interestingly enough, in Australia, it's YouTube Podcasts as well, just by 1% that goes above Spotify. But if you think about it, listen and see that Spotify is obviously in the game a lot, and so is Apple Podcasts. But I think the one that I ignored, and probably most of us have ignored, is YouTube Podcasts, and that's a really interesting stat for me. Boys, what are your thoughts?
Really is, yeah. Apple Podcast to me has always been a clunky interface. Spotify to me is a company that is just relentless in terms of their innovation and making it a better experience. And often when they bring those new features in, sometimes it can be frustrating because you're like, oh, where did this feature go, or where did that feature go? But inevitably after using it for a few days, you become familiar and habitual with it, and you realize it's a really great change. Something I saw Spotify do recently, in addition to video for podcasts, is their smart shuffle. So now if you want to shuffle your playlist, you can select one of two options: regular shuffle, which will shuffle the songs you have there, or smart shuffle, which will shuffle on all the things that they believe you're interested in. And yeah, I think that's interesting. Mick, what about you?
Well, I'm glad I'm here because we do put our podcast on YouTube, but I mean, we can maybe turn this into a bit of a coaching session for me. Is there any difference between just uploading the podcast onto YouTube and YouTube podcasts?
Well,
It's a really good question, Mick.
Yeah, I wonder whether
Yeah, right. That's what my sentence ends.
So what I think it is that they're listening to podcasts on YouTube, right? And because I don't know whether any of you have YouTube Premium. Do any of you have YouTube Premium? James, maybe? No.
No.
So I have YouTube Premium, and I watch a lot of stuff on YouTube, which makes so I have no ads. I don't get any ads at all, and I can minimize on my phone and consume YouTube, which means, like, for example, I'll give you examples of how I use it. Right, I use it for football and Liverpool. That's probably the main thing. So and these are like pre-shows and post-shows before a game, right? So Liverpool are on a winning streak right now, ladies and gentlemen. Just so you know, as a Liverpool fan, this is the time to be alive.
Rochelle is the third wheel in Ronsley's relationship with Liverpool.
Yeah, and Gabriel comes along as well. But yes, Liverpool is first love for sure. So the point is that rather than watching these shows on YouTube, which are just talk shows really, and the build up to the game, I can just put them on audio only. So it's a show that's playing, but I'm just listening to the audio. So I think that that's what they're referring to. And I could be entirely wrong. And I could be wrong. And it could be YouTube podcast, a separate thing. But I do not think so. I think because I also have access to YouTube Music, which is part of my YouTube Premium, which is like a Spotify, which I haven't used yet. But yeah, that's I think it's YouTube podcasts that they're talking about.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to get the definition from YouTube on what that looks like, or maybe even from James Cridland, because what the definition of a podcast is, I think for that is really interesting, because if it's just content more broadly on YouTube, they might be factoring in a lot of the excerpts, like a lot of clips that have been taken from these longer form shows. Like if you just add in clips from the Joe Rogan podcast and all of these other ones, I mean, the results are going to be skewed very, very easily from that. So, yeah, it will be interesting. I mean, I think it's really important to have a presence on Google if you have your own podcast, because they're owned by on YouTube. Sorry, if you have a podcast, because they're owned by Google, the world's leading search engine, and YouTube is one of the most visited websites in the world. So very, very important to make sure that you have a presence on YouTube if you don't already. But of course, it's an absolute no-brainer to be on all of these platforms if you've got a podcast.
Yeah, 100%. So that was super interesting for me, and I think that it'd be good for us to see which other platforms. If you already have a podcast, you just want to make sure that it's on all the other platforms. You don't know how it's going to get found. But yeah, I thought that was interesting to cover in the news. We might go into the tactics if you have anything else to cover in the news. James, thoughts?
No, let's do it. That was a really good one to dive into. So let's go over to Ronsley now. We can talk about today's tactic, the 3 elements of a good sounding podcast. What are you going to do to help educate Mick, myself, and the viewers today?
Well, another one of my frameworks, obviously. And I thought that it was really interesting because in these tactics, I realize that most of us are business owners and are learning to be podcasters or learning to be presenters and learning to be media people or learning to be marketers, or we're business people that are like salespeople. We can sell, but we're not necessarily marketers or content creators or like people that put a show together. So learning, being part of the podcasting world has obviously allowed me to have access to that, like how to create a show that is actually works. So I broke it down, and we've broken them down into the 3 elements. So I'm gonna show you what they are right now, and I am keen to get your thoughts, both James and Mick, on maybe I have like I have missed something, and if I have, I'd love to know what it is. So the 3 elements of a good sounding podcast. Even if you can't see this, right, and even if you can just listen or maybe follow the sound of my voice, you'll understand what I'm trying to say. So 3 elements of a good sounding podcast. There are 3 main things that you got to do when you release an episode. You got to engage, you got to entertain, and you got to elevate. And I'll explain what each one of these mean. Okay, so first let's go into the engage part. So to engage does not mean to occupy the attention of, which is quite easy for us to think of it. It's like, oh, that's what he means by engage. But what I mean by engage here specifically is to engage with the podcast or the podcast host. So how does your audience engage back with you? So that's what I mean by engage here. So how do you create content which creates this kind of engagement where your listeners engage back with the podcast or the host, right? So that's engage. Entertain, what I mean by entertain is to keep someone absorbed. I suppose it could mean engage as well. So that's why I was very clear on the different definitions. So this is engage, to engage back with the audience, with the podcast, sorry. And this is entertain, to keep someone absorbed. And then to elevate what I mean by that in this